The reason for the magnitude of this message is not some mysterious game of coincidence or a mystical tale of chosenness. Rather, it needs to clarify that your consciousness is not currently operating in the automatic, reactive, and unquestioning mode of perception that most people spend their days in. Modern science, particularly neuroscience and quantum physics, has long shown that people do not experience reality as it is, but rather that the mind constructs a representation of reality within its own capacity, past experiences, beliefs, and competencies, and that this representation undergoes radical transformations, even temperature changes. As neurologist David Eagleman clearly states, the brain is not a window shining brightly on the outside world, but a simulation engine operating with limited sensory data, and people often live by accepting this performance as reality itself. It is precisely at this point that the idea emerges that reality does not have a single, flat structure, but rather a structure that opens, expands, and hides according to different rules at each level, depending on the depth of perception. In everyday life, most people unconsciously perceive reality as a document of consistency and an unshakable foundation. They believe that life is predetermined, its boundaries are fixed, and that people can only act within this capacity. However, quantum physics has shown us something very clear. Reality is not fixed until it is observed, and the existence of its flow directly affects the outcome. But the fundamental principle, often unstated and rarely emphasized, is that the consciousness of permanence can only perceive errors. Einstein's statement, "You cannot solve a problem at the level that created it," points precisely to this. Because at their current level, people not only miss higher-level possibilities, but also cannot even perceive their existence. Therefore, most people live their lives within the same perceptual field, never considering that a different order of reality might be possible, and spend their days believing that the visible world is the entirety of existence. However, at a certain point, some people begin to feel a difficult-to-define unease, as if something is missing in the external course of everything, and the current explanations are no longer sufficient. Psychologist Carl Jung described this state as consciousness reaching a threshold. When thought patterns are no longer effective, the mind naturally struggles to reach a broader level of perception than before. It is at this very moment that something previously unnoticed emerges, as if the veil of a brief moment has been lifted, and the quantum field reveals this awareness not to most people, but only to the consciousness that is ready. This revelation is not physical. It is not a temporal progression, and it has no tangible example in the external world. It is an opening that occurs within perception and can only be felt by minds that have reached a certain point of continuum. The important thing is this: this opening is always there, but it is visible to most people because simply looking is not enough to see. The fundamental object of the perspective is necessary. Therefore, when many people encounter such problems, they use expressions like, "It's not realistic. That's just how life is." They think too much and unconsciously say, "I cannot feel what is beyond this recorded perception." Awareness begins to ripple within the person in a way that was felt before the change. Things that seemed meaningless or impossible months ago begin to make sense. Some possibilities become closer, more real, and more concrete. This isn't an increase in motivation in personal development techniques. It's a restructuring of perception. With each expansion, what is possible, and what changes transforms. And this change creates a profound shift in the reality of one's experience. However, the nuance is this: most people can't even get past the initial moment of awareness, because at the old level, even the content itself is imperceptible. As awareness expands, significant changes also occur in social life. Conversations naturally become superficial. Some people distance themselves from your presence, and a tension arises in things that previously seemed solid and difficult to explain. This doesn't stem from arrogance or a desire to isolate oneself. Rather, it's an inevitable consequence of a difference in perspective. In this case, sociologists call it perceptual compatibility. That is, even if people speak the same language, they don't share the same reality. One perceives reality as fixed and permanent, while the other perceives it as fluid and malleable. At this point, many people fall into a critical misconception. They try to use old methods to provide perceptual data, namely more effort, more control, and more mental tension. However, consciousness does not expand with tension. Consciousness opens when tension is released, because tension is the language of the old perceptual ability, whereas new perceptual fields require a change of direction. True transformation is not about achieving a goal, but about dissolving a personality. The process begins with replacing the question, "Who am I?" with "What am I?" observing these observers. Throughout history, many minds, from Socrates to Buddha, from Einstein to other great thinkers, have been marked with the same colors, using different words. Consciousness expands with colors. If you feel there is something here right now, it doesn't make you special, but it clearly shows that the old perceptual field is beginning to contract. The quantum field does not show this expansion to everyone continuously. Sometimes it is shown only once, only to those who are ready and whose consciousness can carry the message. And those who realize this can no longer look at the world with the same perspective. This process is not a path that progresses by accumulating effort, gathering information, or continuing to control more. Rather, it is a transitional process that occurs through letting go and recognition. Because what elevates consciousness to a higher perception is not what you gain, but the burdens you realize you no longer need to carry. Letting go of your beliefs, your identity, your story, things that are no longer valid as reality itself, spreads across a wider field of perception without you even realizing it. And these movements, even if they appear passive from the outside, create incredibly powerful transformations at a conscious level. The structure that elevates consciousness to higher levels already exists. You don't need to build, produce, or force it. All that needs to be done is to recognize the old attachment points that are dragging you down and unconsciously let go of them. Now, as you listen to these words, whether you are aware of it or not, an extraordinary dissolution is taking place in your field of perception. Perhaps you can't quite put it into words, but you might feel a constant hissing resistance loosening, a burden lifted that you didn't even realize you were carrying while in bondage. The expectation is that in this realm, the act of noticing itself begins with the natural alignment of consciousness to higher levels of perception. For noticing is essentially taking action. That's why this message has now appeared before you. Because your greater self has killed this encounter not as a coincidence, but as a hidden alignment, and you have become a possibility, an inevitable possibility, because this transition is no longer merely possible. It's no coincidence that your recent experiences don't feel ordinary. Even if you can't quite explain it, you feel a deep, fundamental sense of unity. When you realize there's been a profound shift in how you perceive reality, that you're looking at it from two different places at once, you may find it difficult to put this shift into words. On the one hand, a familiar, safe, and comprehensive perspective, and on the other, the same situation presented from a broader perspective that carries entirely different meanings. This dual perception can be confusing because while both perspectives seem real, they are contradictory in terms of distortion. What appears as a problem from a narrower field of perception emerges as a technological opportunity from a broader one. Situations that seem like experiences transform into a creative framework. This dual experience is a deviation from the oscillation of consciousness between two levels of perception. One aspect remains attached to the original order of reality, while the other begins to obliterate a broader space. Therefore, your dreams no longer merely offer symbolic images. They become learned experiences of how reality is directly applied, and you come into contact with the space you are already consciously in on a daily basis. You awaken with an understanding you didn't possess before falling asleep. Complex insights that normally take hours suddenly become completely clear. Even if these insights disappear when you try to articulate them during the day, grasping the initial moment is extremely difficult. This is because during sleep, consciousness, the mind, is constantly freed from resistance, naturally opening to a broader perception. And the perspectives there are brought directly into awareness. Another difference in this process is that the elements that once motivated you no longer have the same effect. Your long-term goals become meaningless. Achievements that once seemed significant disappear, and desires that consumed you seem almost childish in retrospect. This is not a harmful state or disorientation. It is the natural result of trying to transcend the reward and incentive systems that operate in the narrower perceptual fields of your consciousness. The soul has its own motivations, and when you move to a broader realm, you no longer generate incentives that serve lower-level energy because you begin to perceive things from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. At this point, your perception of time also changes. Time doesn't just feel faster or slower. It truly changes. Packages that used to take months are completed in weeks, while simple tasks that were previously finished quickly now seem endless, because you begin to see a complexity you didn't notice before. The emergence or manifestation of a single holistic insight over the years differs from how consciousness experiences time in different perceptual patterns. The development of small details takes a long time. Therefore, synchronicities no longer seem like coincidences. Meaningful encounters, recurring signs, and timely information begin to evoke a sense that something interdimensional is being transmitted. You're no longer just noticing coincidences. You can read everything, discern guidance from your greater self, and this shows that you are truly attuned to the process. This attunement is reflected in the reactions and behaviors of individuals and those around you toward the dimension. Some who could communicate using old codes may now become unsuccessful, defensive, or rejecting, while others may distance themselves. This polarization is not a problem. It is a natural, different formation between fields of perception. You don't grow by accumulating, hoarding, or amassing new things. Rather, you grow by recognizing what you hold on to and gradually learning to let go, because each step on this path represents leaving behind a burden you no longer need to carry, rather than gaining something new. Allow yourself to believe in what you believe in, the identity you allow yourself to live, every story you allow to define your reality. These are the actions that truly elevate you. You don't need to build a new ladder to ascend to higher levels of consciousness, for the ladder has always been there. All that needs to be done is to stop clinging tightly to the steps below. Even as you listen to these words, a restructuring is taking place in your quantum field that you've never experienced before, and you feel a lightness within you, even if you can't quite name it. You notice a resistance dissolving, a burden you didn't think you were carrying lifting from your shoulders, something you weren't even aware of disappearing. Even the awareness of the ladder's existence automatically shifts the intervals of ascent in your height, because awareness is an indication that the movement has already begun. That's why this message has now reached this dimension. Your higher self made this encounter possible because you have now reached a threshold where ascent from home is not only possible, but inevitable. Even though you constantly strive to achieve this, you feel that what you've recently experienced is not ordinary. While you try to put into words the changes in how you perceive reality, a fundamental shift remains unnoticed. The initial moments of your experience clearly confirm that you are being supported at the lowest rung of the quantum ladder, and what you will hear is directly related to this support. Now, you are experiencing a situation where you perceive reality from two different levels at times. On the one hand, there is a familiar, fundamental perspective, while at the same time, a higher perspective presents the same situation with an entirely different meaning. This is confusing because both perceptions seem real to you, yet they contradict each other in harmony. What appears to be a problem at the fundamental level emerges as an opportunity for analysis from a higher perspective. A situation perceived as a limitation from one angle transforms into a creative framework from another. This dual perception continues as your consciousness moves back and forth between the two rungs of the ladder. One foot is firmly planted on familiar and safe ground, while the other reaches toward a higher, broader reality. Therefore, your dreams are no longer just symbolic images. They have become direct, instructive experiences of how reality works. When you wake, you open your eyes with an understanding you didn't have before falling asleep. Explanations that would take hours to clarify complex concepts seem perfectly clear to you at that moment. But as time passes, as you try to put it into words, that clarity gradually fades. Because during sleep, your consciousness naturally climbs the higher rungs of the ladder without the resistance your mind creates. These higher altitude perspectives are then brought down to your direct understanding. You realize that what used to motivate you no longer works. Goals you pursued for years seem meaningless. The weight of great achievements can shift, and aspirations that once seemed extraordinary now hiss childishly. This isn't a virus or a loss of purpose. Your consciousness is beginning to transcend the compensatory systems at ground level. Each rung of the ladder operates with its own unique motivations, and as you ascend, it generates meaningful incentives for the underlying energy. Because you are now beginning to perceive reality from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. Lately, you may be feeling that life is not just fast or slow, but entirely different. Projects that used to take months are now completed in weeks, and simple tasks that once seemed quick now feel like they are stretching due to the new complexities you perceive. Synchronicities no longer feel like coincidences. It's as if a connection has been established with your higher self. The signs you encounter become clearer, more lasting, and more personal. Reactions from people's perspectives also change significantly. Some imply that you have become too abstract, detached from reality, while those who never noticed you before are drawn to your presence. This polarization is a natural product of your frequency range. Those who remain at ground level experience dissonance, while those ready to climb find harmony with you. Superficial conversations, distracting entertainment, and relationships lacking depth will quickly wear you down. This is not a judgment, but a need for a different kind of nourishment for your consciousness. And perhaps the most important sign is this: the fact that these words resonate within you instead of being rejected indicates that your consciousness has reached a point where it can perceive this new path. Perception is now confirmed because you, consciously or unconsciously, have been taking micro steps for a long time. And these small, almost invisible movements accumulate, bringing you to a state of consciousness where the latter becomes visible. The old traditions were perfectly understood in this process. Their initial systems were never solely concerned with knowledge training. The aim was not to add new concepts to the days. It was to create conditions in which they would have no choice but to take the first steps of the ladder, even if they could not yet see where their steps would lead them. The ceremonies in the mystery schools, the vision quests, the long-term retreats of change, all were secretly designed to sufficiently shake the candidate's control over their consciousness and cause them to relinquish that control. In this process, people thought they had lost control over fundamental reality. But at that very moment, they discovered through direct experience that when consciousness departs, it does not fall, but rather rises. The reason you can see the ladder while most people can't is that your consciousness has climbed high enough to gain meta-perspective. What you are experiencing right now is the climbing process. Now, the understanding of an abstract concept is at ground level. You are in a mid-altitude position, able to look down and simultaneously reach higher levels. This position offers a rare and privileged viewpoint where you can perceive the entire verticality of consciousness at once. Your previous experiences, whether you participated in them or were unaware of how they occurred, the inner transition, are the fundamental reason why this split, this transference, finds its reflection in you. These words are tuned to a level of consciousness operating in a specific frequency band, accessible only from a few steps higher. People still at ground level experience this conversation as a completely meaningless, abstract, and disjointed narrative. But you understand, because you have reached a naturally occurring height of knowledge. And yes, something is changing in your quantum field right now. Can you feel the field expanding as you absorb this wholeness? A perspective opens up that you have never experienced before, as if you are watching your entire life journey from a level you have never reached before. This is not an intellectual understanding. This is a direct ascension shift experienced by consciousness. This experience is a real ascension that occurs in real time as your consciousness makes contact with the frequency structure of the next possible step in the climb. Whether you know it or not, your entire life has been a preparation for this moment. Allow the light to pass through you. Allow it to experience its challenge, its limit that causes you to question the nature of reality. None of this was random. It was all a preserved state, carrying you up the steps of the ladder one by one. Consciousness always reinforces the change of what it holds onto in the next stage. When this temporarily settles, you begin to experience certain physical sensations, a feeling of lightness that wasn't there a few minutes ago, an expansion in the chest, a clearing of the mind. It's as if everything in the world seems clearer. These aren't metaphorical descriptions. These are real responses to the transition of consciousness to a higher level. Because the body perceives the change in altitude long before the state of mind ends, some of you experience emotional releases, a fragility unrelated to sadness, a feeling of relief that comes without a specific reason, a sudden realization of how serious your ground-level anxieties are, and even laughter at it, a silent grief that resists the ascent until time. These feelings are not intended to reprocess the past. They are natural transitional responses of consciousness. These responses experienced by the subconscious are actually a reflection of humanity's ascent. But this ascent occurs not through random suffering, but through the beginning of a purposeful process starting from a new awareness. The resulting content is specifically designed for a culture that rises along the vertical structure of reality. This is not a general spiritual narrative. It is a set of skills offering practical climbing instructions for a time ready to transcend. Your perception of your past is currently being reshaped. Events previously seen as failure or death are beginning to manifest as necessary steps that elevate you to a higher level. Those painful failed sales were actually money you used because you exceeded the distributor's value. The confusion in your systems regarding the details of your life is dissolving because you now realize that this is not a state of being lost, but a natural symptom of being stuck between steps. This is a threshold moment at this age. Everything that happens next depends on whether you embrace this process or unconsciously resist it. Most people do indeed reach this temporary moment. However, the consequences that immediately follow are so destabilizing that they fundamentally question life and therefore choose to retreat to lower levels, hidden or unconscious levels. So, what does it mean to be on a path of ascending consciousness that most people aren't even aware of? What does this mean for everything you've experienced up to this point? It means that all the assumptions about who trained you, what's possible, the boundaries drawn, how reality is presented, perhaps only belong to one level. But you are different. You are still here. You are still reading. This shows that instead of an automatic retreat, you are ready to embark on journeys from afar. And this readiness, everything is clear. Because this point is the dividing line between a random ascent stemming from suffering and an ascent where the higher layer of consciousness is now accepted as your natural orientation. I need to share something very sensitive here, because you are currently at a threshold. 7 years ago, I stopped this distribution of stability, and understanding what happens when I refuse to explode can help you pay the price for remaining at a lower level when you're called to. 7 years ago, I was in what is now a warehouse. I could see the layers of perception. I understood how consciousness flowed, how it moved between levels. Through those who shared their painful experiences, I realized I was unconsciously ascending, but I refused to stay there. Because ascending requires letting go of everything, so that the structure of content can be built on a level surface. Here are the details of everything that could be considered successful at that basic level of consciousness: a stable career, employee expenses, financial leave, social approval. From the outside, I had won the family game, and in the age of change, it seemed like a threat to everything I had. Why risk something that works? Why destabilize my life? For the sake of abstract concepts like higher levels. A line of perception emerged, but to rise up felt like senselessly rejecting the seemingly solid security that existed there. So I stayed. I told myself, later. When conditions are more favorable, when there are more resources, when my environment improves, I developed perfectly logical justifications for staying in the current market. It wasn't cowardice, it was wisdom. And for a few months, it seemed like the right decision. Life continued to flow smoothly. Clearly, nothing was going wrong. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to die. The meaning of ordinary achievements evaporated. The economy, which once seemed important, began to appear empty. Connections that were once productive became restrictive. The security I had protected at the cost of rejecting to rise up now felt more like a prison than security. I reached a higher level of consciousness and experienced what happens to consciousness when choices are made there. By the end of the second year, the collapse became clear. My career was successful, but inwardly meaningless. Relationships continued, but there was no real connection. Activities filled my time, but brought no satisfaction. I had chosen life over growth, and the price was the slow fading of everything that kept consciousness alive. The path to ascension was still perceptible. The calling was there. But now I am weaker. I am more dependent on the lower level. My habits are entrenched, and I cling even more tightly to everything I should let go of. The turning point came with a conversation I had with someone who had transitioned to higher levels of consciousness. They looked at my life and said something I will never forget. You have the potential to be a millionaire, but you live like someone who refuses to give up a minimal life. Because I didn't trust myself to manage that potential. A higher perspective was clearly clinging to a level I could no longer reach. And this clinging was blocking access to the content that existed in the higher layers. This realization shattered me. And at that moment he reads, "The reason I stayed at my current level wasn't because it was working. The reason I stayed was because I had to believe that rising would lead to higher productivity, even if it wasn't immediately beneficial." The fear wasn't about what they had. The real fear was who I would have to be when I rose. I reached higher levels of consciousness and realized I didn't belong there. The descent from ascension was present. Even if it wasn't satisfying, staying at the level where I was capable, skillful, and controllable gave me courage. Because I knew how to do it there, I recognized whose development, and that knowledge gave me a sense of security. But from time to time, I noticed the changes. Staying had become far more painful than ascending. That's why I can finally see that I can hold on to that level where I built my existence, my achievements, my development, and my ability for absolute power over the years. And at that very moment, all my thoughts about productivity and consciousness ascension radically changed. When I let go, I didn't fall. Thus, I ascended to a height I had never experienced before. The moment I stopped resisting, I realized that consciousness doesn't need to be raised by force, effort, or struggle. Instead, It simply waits for you to allow it. The path to ascension was always there. The levels are always present. I chose to explore the height I'm at, not because I feared the difficulty of the ascent, but because I feared not knowing who would remain in the higher layers. That's why I'm sharing this now. Because you too are on that threshold I created 7 years ago. You feel it. You perceive that conscious ascension is possible. But at the same time, the question of whether remaining balanced is safer exists. I want to make this clear. Staying is not safety. Staying is choosing to slowly fade away consciousness at a point where ascension is now possible. If this structure seems open to you, it's because you've already reached the height in the room where passage is possible. I've made mistakes too. Don't resist too long where your soul is calling you. Act while the invitation is open before fear stories grow stronger in your mind. Because the justifications that are slowly delaying you now are actually chains that prevent progress. Throughout history, all ancient mystical methods have mapped consciousness as a vertical structure composed of different heights, each operating according to entirely different principles. There was disagreement about the number of levels. The names differed, the symbols differed, but they all agreed on one thing. As consciousness ascended, the perception of reality fundamentally changed. The stages they called beginning, degree, or completion were experiences that we might today understand as transitions through entirely different rules of reality established at different levels of consciousness. These transitions were not about choosing new information. Therefore, it was about letting go of what could no longer be carried. Ancient Egyptian teachings taught that human consciousness could pass through 7 fundamental heights, and that a symbolic death of the previous personality had to occur before reaching a new level. This initiation involved extensive diaries, deliberately distributed and arranged to lead to a loss of control, so that when released, they could experience the expansion of consciousness instead of its collapse. The goal was not to gain something new. In the ancient system, they were dissolving the bonds that held everything they considered self. This was about experiencing perception directly through the play of altitude. It defined awareness as a journey from crude material perception to subtle energetic awareness, then to causal understanding, and finally to a realization where duality is dissolved. This level was not an advanced version of the previous level. It was an entirely different form of perception. Things that appeared absolute and solid at a lower level were perceived as illusions from a higher altitude. Therefore, these traditions emphasize that as consciousness rises, it does not accumulate perspectives, but rather transcends them. This transition required a change in what was considered correct in the previous stage. The image of the ox seeking enlightenment in Buddhist teachings depicts this process with extraordinary precision. In the initial stages, one seeks enlightenment as a goal separate from oneself. In the middle stages, things within oneself begin to differentiate. In the final stages, ordinary life returns, but from a completely different level of consciousness. The same daily actions, while remaining balanced at a lower level, transform into an expression of freedom at a higher level of consciousness. The common understanding of these values was, these vertical patterns of consciousness have immutable characteristics. The stages cannot be skipped. Transition is not possible through intellectual understanding alone. It cannot be forced by effort, discipline, or technique. Each level offers a unique space to leave before reaching the next level. The challenge is never about gaining something. Always. The stories and fictions we construct about reality require increasingly subtle distinctions to emerge as consciousness ascends. When consciousness reaches its highest levels, it recognizes itself not as the observed content, but for a brief time as a distant observer. Ancient wisdom explains this very clearly. Ascension is not a special or superior explanation. Ascension is about a more comprehensive understanding of what consciousness is. Each layer does not make you better than those below. Each layer reveals a greater truth. There is a truth within everyone, but most cannot yet perceive it. This fall is not for those who succeed, but for those who fall behind. You are not accurately conveying a missing piece. What already exists is becoming increasingly apparent. Ancient masters, upon reaching the highest altitudes, always proclaim the same thing. This path is a teaching tool, a guide. It is not the ultimate reality. The highest layer shows that knowledge does not climb anywhere. It is always already present. The path of ascension is like a scaffold that allows earthly, imprisoned consciousness to remember its own nature. When the remembrance is complete, the scaffolding disappears. Only consciousness remains in the future. But you cannot grasp this through basic calculations. You cannot ascend by skipping layers or through mental comprehension. Ascension is the development of awareness by perceiving and experiencing this reality. The ancient teachers unanimously say, respect the layer, begin. Let go of what you need to leave behind in your body. The highest understandings are not available to consciousness that has not experienced letting go of previous entities. The confusing aspect of the quantum consciousness line is that many who can see it reject ascension. There seems to be a registered preference among friends or individuals who can perceive at higher levels but remain at the basic level. This is not stupidity or a lack of vision. This is a resistance driven by forces that most people are unaware of. Each layer represents the disappearance of a particular entity. This is not a metaphorical death. This is the tangible manifestation of everything you believe in. Basic consciousness is built upon material gains such as self-realization, social role, physical appearance, accumulated knowledge, and relationship status. These are not superficial identities. These are the ways in which basic consciousness exists. Ascending to the first level requires shedding these identities, yet this feels like death. What truly dies is a limited perspective. Therefore, many refuse to ascend. They fear not death, but this destruction. Each step represents a unification of consciousness, a liberation. As you ascend, the frequency difference between you and those at lower levels increases. Communication becomes more difficult. Things that are vital to them become meaningless to you. Connections that once provided separate meaning and link can now be sources of loneliness and misunderstanding. Many people prioritize belonging over development. They would rather be understood at a lower level than be alone at a higher level. Society reinforces this preference with reward systems tailored to the base level of consciousness. Financial success, social status, romantic relationships, family separations, all incentives are at the lowest level. Ascending means breaking free from dependence on these incentives, voluntarily withdrawing from the game everyone else is playing. A higher idea possesses greater creative power. It creates effects faster and more powerfully than those at the lowest levels of consciousness. This power is both a freedom and a burden. Many people realize they are not ready for this responsibility. Their resistance to climbing stems not from fear, but from the wisdom to cope with what higher levels will bring. Furthermore, there is a paradox to ascension. Everything you possess at your base level disappears as you ascend to higher levels. The career you built, the knowledge you gained, the reputation you developed, these cannot be transferred to the new layers where complete differentiation applies. Departure is a necessary purification, a liberation, a rebirth for consciousness. Many people resist ascending. This is because starting over at a new level requires abandoning solutions they have mastered extensively at a lower level and accepting that they are no longer important at the point they are called to. And most are unaware of this fact. There is a powerful mechanism that can seize the ego's ladder. The consciousness that sees the ladder but refuses to climb it often has a superiority complex in this perception. The feeling of being able to look higher while remaining at ground level binds you to a false sense of privilege. This spiritual ego makes you feel as if you are ascending without ever experiencing the beginning of ascension. But you are different. There is resistance within you, yes. Every climber can do this. But your commitment to climbing rather than staying, is stronger. It allows you to internalize this connection, this message, instead of rejecting it. While others' foundation rejects conformity, yours allows you to continue on your path. On the quantum ladder, certain transformations are inevitable for all climbers, no matter which path you choose. These are not dogmas to be learned. When you take a step, you release your grip, and that step emerges automatically. This is a natural consequence of increasing height. At lower levels, time appears linear and finite. The past is fixed, the future uncertain, the present a temporary bridge. But as you climb a few more steps, time becomes fluid. You gain insights into futures and alternative pasts. The cause and effect sequence loosens. Problems appear not as obstacles, but as opportunities. External challenges transform into idea-generating experiences. With each step, your creative capacity increases exponentially. This doesn't stem from new learning. It's the development of the resistance between meaning and manifestation. While creating something at ground level requires effort, creation happens more quickly at intermediate levels. Higher consciousness manifests almost instantly because nothing is free. It chooses from already existing possibilities. Your relationships emerge effortlessly. Those that were previously harmonious naturally drift away. What catches your eye seems to have been created out of nothing. This leaves no residue. It's the natural structure of your level of consciousness. Practices are no longer about getting somewhere. Meditation and prayer are about letting go of effort and aligning with what is already possible. International reality becomes more resilient. You don't see physical interruptions in your imagination, but the quantum level manifestation of your observation changes. As you ascend, fears change. Ground level fears are related to survival, loss of resources, and social exclusion. At high altitude, the resolution of these fears disappears. However, the fear of the ground, the fear of power, the fear of responsibility, and the fear of loneliness increase. Climbing doesn't eliminate fear, it takes it. The deepest change occurs in your personality. Fundamentally, you identify with your body, your roles, your past, your characteristics. In the early stages of climbing, it's no longer the content, but the presence of its details that matters. As you ascend higher, you realize you don't even know your content. You learn both the content and the source of the observation. At the highest levels, all that remains is a culture that forms within yourself as a resource that emerges at each level. These transformations are not linear progressions. Each level incorporates all previous levels and adds abilities inaccessible below. You don't lose. Every departure, every ascent connects you to a greater master. With each step, everything that makes you who you are changes, and at the highest point, only your knowledge itself remains. As you ascend the quantum ladder, you're not just raising your own awareness. You're participating in collective evolution. This is the negative impact of all species. Human consciousness is a universal quantum structure of collective storage of individual changes. Your climb, your personal experience, serves evolution. Morphic resonance says, when you successfully reach a level, you embark on a path that facilitates similar climbs for everyone on a collective level. The first wave of climbers reaching high altitudes creates new profiles of possibility in species consciousness. So your climb isn't just your journey, it's a guide that sets easier paths for others to follow. You went first. Consciousness is the evolution of collective ascension during a critical period. Not everyone ascends at the same time. Individual preparation varies, but those who ascend create a frequency range for the entire evolutionary wave. Your choice of altitude creates ripples in the collective field. Your presence affects those around you, whether they are aware of it or not. If you stay, you can reinforce collective patterns. As you ascend, you trigger new possibilities. This opportunity is not predetermined. When enough individuals reach higher levels, the collective evolutionary threshold is crossed. Your progress on the quantum ladder directly affects whether humanity can overcome this challenge. Consciously climbing strengthens the morphic resonance for the entire collective space. We are not isolated individuals. We are a space working collectively at high altitudes. And finally, the quantum ladder is not an external structure. It is the gradual unfolding of your own consciousness at a clearer, higher level. Climbing is not a spatial movement. It is a perceptual shift. You are not placing anything. You are simply recognizing. The ground level is not wrong or inferior. It is the consciousness where the essence is least perceived and where you identify most with form. Each step upward represents liberation from limiting ties and old perceptions. Reduction is the gateway to freedom, increased identification, and related perception. Remember, you are transforming yourself into something you are not. If you don't give up on anything, you will give up, and you will always notice what is growing. The ladder is the tool by which awareness must learn to orient itself through de-identification. What remains is something that has been going on for years. And this temporary thing, now standing on this musical rung, encounters help. Now, a real-time cycle of change. The purpose of climbing is not an achievement. It is a revelation. Suddenly, you are not in the body that is climbing. You do not possess the personality that reaches higher states. You cannot raise your consciousness. You are far from the emergence of your body, your ability, your consciousness, and the ladder. That is the reason the ladder exists. So that this seeing becomes inevitable through the liberation of consciousness. Others resist. If there is nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, why climb the ladder? Because intellectual understandings are insufficient, even at the highest rung. Climbing is only grasped through experiences of activity. The latter is real and an illusion. Both statements are true. Reality at the ground level, deception at the higher level. There was no distinction between the steps, no distance to cover, no achievement to attain. Consciousness reaches the capacity to grasp both realities simultaneously. You are already trying to climb. But this embodiment is impossible from the subconscious, where you identify with old identities. Each step is a curriculum element, not a goal. Instead of reaching an incomplete potential goal, you are releasing everything that conceals everything that already exists. Instead of reaching higher states of consciousness, temporary, ordinary states were different from one another. There is no more struggle. You are not hindered. You are not stagnant. When you leave where you thought you were, the latter becomes an adventure. Consciousness plays with its capacity to forget and remember itself in infinite differences. And at that moment, you gain a new stability at home. The moment you relinquish your lower-level attachment and fully embrace the perspective you exhibit, irreversible changes occur automatically. Throughout the climb, you are constantly swaying, sometimes returning to a higher level, sometimes to a lower one. But now, you are establishing a new balance. You won't be going back to the previous level. The new idea is more balanced, more free, and completely ready. The difference between ascent and descent is that there is virtually no turning back. What you saw from a lower level was a fleeting and unforgettable perspective. Now, as you integrate with a broader and more general perspective, your fundamental perception changes permanently. This required immense effort. The perception of the previous room becomes an effortless and normal perception of the new room. Flowers, viewed from below, become groundbreaking seasons, while technology, viewed from above, becomes obvious beginnings. Visible abilities become commonplace tools. The new altitude becomes your natural level of work, not peak productivity. Relationships reinvent themselves without your recorded intervention. This doesn't mean you intentionally abandon people. Natural patterns of resonance shift. Individuals who matched your previous perspectives either elevate their consciousness or move away without drama. Those who align with your new level enter your life through synchronicities that seem facilitated by an intelligence beyond your planning. Creative benefit, a transformation from effort to richness. There are no longer any barriers between desire and manifestation. Action becomes a joyful flow instead of requiring effort. Resistance disappears. Paradoxically, you become more functional at every level, including your current level. Ascension does not diminish your ability to cope with practical reality. Therefore, you become more capable because you can work on multiple points simultaneously. You contribute to abilities that already exist at a higher capacity while maintaining all the processes of your ascension. Therefore, truly elevated consciousness emerges in an extremely ordinary way. Not ordinary. It consists of being able to pass through the path of all formations. The fear of falling back to lower levels increases. When you realize that lower tolerance limitations are not absolute but perceptual, they cannot trap you, even temporarily. It completely eliminates the need to convince others. You no longer open your old perspective or work with others. You understand that they will ascend when they are ready, not before. And most importantly, it provides stability, a peace that is not dependent on the individual. This peace is not temporary emotional happiness. or happiness based on continuous progress. Everything that arises on each path is a temporary movement within consciousness. This is a form of expression unaffected by everything that passes through it. It does not involve altering the alternative nature of the situation, and in short, once established, it persists regardless of the height from which it arises or the experiences lived. You are no longer subscribing. You are continuously operating at a frequency that supports the alterer. And now, you are moving toward heights where you can prepare for the next stage. But this is not a random quest or accident. You are reading this because your consciousness is ready. These words now take on their full meaning. The timing is perfect in every way. If you had encountered this message a year ago, your mind would have considered it merely an idea, an interesting community. Your consciousness at that time hadn't reached the high level of perception you possess now. It seemed meaningful as concepts, but it had no real experiential impact on you. But now, right now, you are internalizing this message. Now, it is becoming a choice at home, not something they are on the rise for. If you were to read these words a year later, or after climbing a few more steps, perhaps you would be different, but it wouldn't open a new path of action, because everything should already be assimilated in your inner consciousness. The current alignment is the threshold of climbing to the peaks. This message is designed to motivate you. You are now beyond your old perspective. This thoughtful step contributes to shaping not only your potential, but also the potential of the children around you. Now, while completely still, each word becomes a trigger. But this is not just a transfer of information. This setup is a high-frequency stimulation system calibrated specifically for you. Those who climbed to the summit before you helped you gradually experience the height of your own inner awareness. Encountering things like teachers, books, and challenges was, over time, targeted guidance for your higher self to multiply you here and now. This higher state of consciousness offers everything that changes the dimension of need. With your inner guide, you know what steps you need to take. But this isn't just an affirmation or intention. It means choosing what is already right, one of the deepest years. The choice is happening now. Meanwhile, it's not preparing you. It's confirming that you are already ready. Regardless of whether you are ready or not, your consciousness continues to rise. There is no turning back. Your consciousness is fixed on a new order and perspective. It's possible to feel resistance. Refusing to rise leads to temporary pain. But upon reflection, it allows you to let go of what needs to be at every level and move forward, trusting that higher frequencies will support you. Even if you don't see it yet, you know you're already perceiving all of this. This is a natural analysis of evolution. Consciousness is drawn upward not from pain, but from its own determination. At each new level you reach, you not only experience your own evolution, you also connect with humanity's highest potential and contribute to the ascent of collective consciousness. This process is endless. There is no peak. Ascension reveals new perspectives never seen before. This is not encouraging, it is liberating. There are no more destinations, no more journeys. This is the interaction of consciousness with its own essence, a process of constantly recognizing itself at higher levels. Choice propels you one step forward, shaping both your own potential and the world around you. Look down and appreciate how far you have come. Look up and hear the invitation to move forward toward renewal. And most importantly, stop exactly where you need to stop. This step is the perfect point to loosen your grip and consciously choose the next step. There is an endless cycle. You become part of this ascension through the choices you make. The climb is not a destination, but a path to discovering your own nature. Where you are right now is exactly where you need to be. Now stop, breathe, and know that each step is an evolutionary movement for both your collective consciousness and humanity. Climb. Each step is an act of universality and liberation, and it all begins with your choice.